We are back. I'm Dave.
I'm Janet.
Book on Fire podcast. We are reading The Dawn of Everything still. We are still talking about chapter 10. In fact, we're back to talk about the conclusion to chapter 10, why the state has no origin. Lots of good stuff coming up in this chapter, lots to talk about. But before we get started on it, we did want to announce here that we've created a way for y'all to give us a tip, like a monetary tip for putting on this podcast, just in case, because we've been approached by people in the past who've been like,
can I give you money?
Can I give you some money? This is so valuable. You know, I was really helped by, reading Caliban with y'all or something. So we just decided to go ahead and formalize that using the website or whatever called Buy Me a Coffee. Mm-hmm. So now if you look at the show notes for any of our episodes, I added a link on there that says buy us a coffee, and you can click that and you can give us $5, $10. A lot of podcasts have Patreons. We're not doing that. We're not consistent enough, to have a Patreon. We're just doing this on the side.
This is a labor of love and not our income.
Yeah. That's not our intention with this.
But we do spend a lot of time on this when we're doing it.
It does take a lot of time. It takes a lot of time in the editing and in the preparation and everything. So, that option is there now. If you feel moved to do that, there's a way to do that without emailing us and asking for our PayPal.
Yeah, and speaking of labors of love, there's a good chance that any and all tips are going to be going towards our sliding scale herbal clinic that we run in Marshall.
Yeah, that's right.
Because we give away a lot there as well. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to learn.
And there's some store-bought things like supplements and things like that our clients can use that we don't make. And so it's harder for us to give away. Right. And so, there might be a fund that we build.
Also, I just want to say quickly, for the record, our clinic is set up to serve the local community. And so I don't mean to be promoting it as if anybody can come.
Yeah, that's a good point.
We don't really do distance consultations right now and still have pretty full caseloads. So this is for local folks.
Okay, so that having been said, we can move on to the rest of chapter 10. When we left off, the Davids were talking about what they call first order regimes of domination. So, they have a theory going on here where they're talking about charismatic power, sovereignty, which is closely wedded to violence, and then control over knowledge, which is connected to administration and bureaucracy, and that these being the three fundamental forms of power that will eventually become entangled with modern states. But they're going back in time and talking about, in the first part of the chapter, which we talked about in the last episode, regimes that maybe only expressed one of these three forms of power. So, which they called first order regimes. Picking up from there, we are on page 399 of the text, actually. How caring labor, ritual killing, and, quote, tiny bubbles all came together in the origins of ancient Egypt.
Right. So one of the things that they're going to talk about here at the beginning of this section on Egypt is just a general pattern that archaeologists have noticed around the globe when digging different impressive sites, places of empire. A common pattern that is seen is there is evidence of mass killing, like a big act of violence that happens within the first few generations of the founding of an empire, or like sort of the emergence of empire comes with a big act of violence.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a really impressive thing to be a pattern that you see around the world.
I think that's part of the point.
You know, yeah, right. I mean, I use that word specifically, to impress people about, I don't know, what somebody can get away with, or, the degree of sacrifice that is going to be entailed or something. I mean, it's ripe for projection or speculation about like how that is supposed to function.
Mm-hmm. Right. And you pointed out earlier when we were talking about this preparing for the episode that they don't always like to point to patterns.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting that this is one that they will agree, like, yeah, this is always there.
Yeah, it's true. Sometimes the Davids don't seem to be as interested in talking about the patterns and the commonalities. Mm-hmm. But in this case, they're like, yeah, this is a common pattern. Mm-hmm. And strange that like it's especially when a kingdom is getting going. Mm-hmm. That the rulers will need to be buried with a lot of other people. Mm-hmm. And the pattern seems to be that the king is buried with a bunch of retainers or people who are kind of part of the court, close to him in some way. These can be courtiers of various kinds, but also just the workers in the court who provided the day-to-day care for the king, like sometimes just like the cooks or the people who groomed the king.
Palace dwarves.
Yeah, in the Egyptian case, the dwarf would get buried with the king, the entertainers, like these type of people. But also, higher level officials and functionaries who are higher status members of the court.
And in some cultures, more outside of Egypt, there would be more likely to be like a smaller group of retainers or retinue and then a large group of captives buried with them. And then there's speculation about whether or not that was out of like preventing those people from gaining power in their cultures on their own.
Yeah.
In China and the Shang Dynasty, this especially happened where there would be a lot of captives killed and buried, where they would desecrate the bodies and arrange parts in different places. And the idea was that their descendants would have less access to them as powerful ancestors.
Yeah.
So that's just an interesting way this can go. And I'm saying that partially just to point to the fact of the violence, the mass killing is common with all of these empires, emerging empires, but the story that people tell around it is really different depending on the culture.
Yeah, for sure. And just to be specific here, they're bringing this up kind of in the context of they're still talking somewhat antagonistically, but talking around this idea about state formation. And they're talking about archaeology and like a pattern in archaeology where when you see these burials of kings with their retainers, then it's commonly interpreted as a sign that things are maybe headed into this dynastic kingdom. They mark a certain transition from one kind of power that might have pre-existed this type of spectacular thing with a big sacrifice, to what might come after, which is like a more entrenched and like orderly hierarchical kingdom type situation.
Right.
Yeah. And in Egypt, we start to see this type of thing in 3000 BC. We're going to stay with Egypt a lot in the second part of the chapter, so get used to us coming back to the Egyptian context a lot. They take this part into a pretty interesting direction because starting from this observation that it's like members of the king's household that would be buried with the king, they use this as a jumping off point to talk about how this is another example of domination entangled with caring relations, where the foundation of a pretty extreme form of hierarchy, of hierarchical power, takes the form of a spectacular sacrifice of sometimes part of the king's literal family, but also his kind of extended family of caring relations. The people the members of his household. And the members of your household being like a certain kind of family, right? In a extensive or expanded sense.
The royal manicurist.
Yeah, the manicurist would be sacrificed and buried with the king as well. And so they present us with this formulation that in order for sovereignty, the principle of sovereignty to be expanded, that it entails a transmutation of violence into kinship. And that like part of the way that power in this way gets expanded, and also they don't use this word, but kind of justified, or the way that it gets like narrativized, is that almost like the whole kingdom is conceived of as the family of the king or in the household of the king. And the king is like the patriarch, not just of his literal household family, but of the kingdom as a household and all of the subjects almost like his children.
Right. Which is also an extension of the care idea, right? Where it's like, I am providing for you. I am caring for you. You know, and that we'll get more into this, but in many of these types of arrangements, the monarch is, again, I think we talked about this in the last episode, they become an intercessor to the divine.
Yeah, and all of this is going in some really interesting places. I did have this thought, though, that the Davids don't exactly state, but, you know, they're kind of saying, like, isn't it interesting that as this type of power becomes more explicit and becomes more entrenched, that it comes in the guise, or it's like enunciated in terms of this like expansion of care and this like expansive idea of the family, at least in a symbolic sense, you know,
through violence.
Yeah. And through violence. Right. But I'm immediately like, well, that sounds very convenient, maybe for people who want to rule over others to frame their domination in terms of what you would do for members of your family, right? Because like in the context of kinship is already where people are primed to make sacrifices. People say like, I would do anything for my brother. These are the contexts where you say, I would do anything for this person. Right? Kinship is defined by these bonds and these willingness to make sacrifices to some extent. Responsibility. Right. You know, like this is the cynical take, I guess, but we are talking about people trying to get power over other people. Like we are talking about people abusing power. So let's like call it maybe for what it is. Right. And this doesn't really get noted by the Davids, but I mean, I don't know. Like, you can relate to what I'm saying.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, you're actually reminding me of that creepy way that in, like, corporate culture and even in the ways that small businesses can emulate corporate cultural framings that people will say, like, you know, you'll start working at a restaurant or something and they're like, you're part of the family now. We're all family here. Or whatever. Yes. And, like, I mean, it's kind of a meme out there that, like, if you hear that when you start a job, you know you're about to get screwed because you're going to be abused and taken advantage of.
Yeah, right. It's like, under the cloak of that kind of framing, bosses feel entitled to demand more from you.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I would include the nonprofit complex within this too, like notoriously,
there's bosses there too. Yeah,
notoriously family framing as well, and willing to ask a lot of people without compensation.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also, I mean, this all points to, I mean, I think we'll probably come back to this through the episode, but I think anyone who's been around one of the gnarlier examples of the patriarchal nuclear family, or has grown up in a evangelical Christian setting, especially we'll see that on the small scale of the family and then the larger scale of the church and the larger scale of the ethno-state. That is the goal for a lot of these people. Yeah. That abuse of power starts at home. And I'm caring for you by abusing you.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So in that context, then it's like only natural that the king would abuse power. Because there's already a template for that.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, like I would say it's not just interesting that we see this pattern of power hiding behind the cloak of caring relations and family, but it's also very convenient for power to hide behind that. You know? I would add on to what the Davids are saying.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and this is going to keep coming up too. Like all the cultures that we're going to be talking about, well, maybe until the very end, there's a framework or a story coming up to justify the conglomeration of power and the hierarchy. Yeah. You know, and the story is different place to place, but care is a common one.
Right.
So, and kinship is as part of that. Care and kinship is a common framing for justifying this dynamic, you know?
Nationalism is all about kinship.
Absolutely.
In theory,
you're right.
Anyway. Yeah.
I think this must have come up in another season, but, you know, like even when you have an authoritarian regime in the form of a liberal democracy, like there's still a spectrum of how much care is given. And you have like Margaret Thatcher criticizing like the nanny state, you know, like we're not going to do everything for these people. We're not like babying you, but she's still using like the kinship care model in some ways.
The framing. Yeah.
It's more about protection.
She's speaking the language.
Those hawkish people leaders tend to be like their form of care is more about protection and defense.
Yeah, right.
And not as much about providing for.
Other people, I think, have written about the daddy form of the state.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Like,
yes, yeah.
Is the state going to be the daddy parent who's like the tough love, you just got to get out there and earn your keep and, all the thing? Or is it going to be like the mommy form, like, which is the forgiving, caring, like doting form of parentage, right?
Right.
This is commonly conceived of as like the left wing and the right wing conceptions of the state.
Oof. Yeah. If only everybody had that mother.
Yeah.
That's not the case always.
Well, it's archetypes.
Yeah, I know. We're talking archetypes in state form, in state craft, and in family craft, for sure. This part about Egypt, the Davids get into a pretty interesting theory, it's an observation and a theory, both a little bit. And one thing that they note is that what we all think of as classical Egypt, right? There's like the pyramids, the Sphinx, there's these very magnificent tombs.
Yeah.
And their mass burials, the Egyptian mass burials of retinue with Pharaoh, tended to be in these monumental structures, whether they were monumentally above the ground or under the ground. There are these pretty big undertakings to create these monumental tombs. And there's various ideas around what those were for, actually. But what's clear is that they were big productions and they required a lot of support and labor. Some of it was forced labor, but they did have some level of corvée labor as well, where everyone had to donate some time to build these structures when they were doing them. But what the Davids posit in this section is that the Egyptians, at least the aristocrats or the monarchs, became preoccupied with the idea of the afterlife and the dead and feeding the ancestors. And it appears that they decided that the dead had a taste for bread, nice bread. And
yeah, this part is funny.
And a taste for fermented grain drink.
Right.
Like beer. What we might call beer, but was probably not exactly beer.
Yeah. They say like, we can imagine, because what they're leading up to is this practice of burying the rulers with a bunch of nice stuff and
people
and sacrificed people
and nice people. Yeah.
Evolves into, and this is still just in Egypt in this case, a full-on mortuary cult, where the dead are taking up a very big place in the culture. And as we're going to see, almost become the organizing principle of all of public life. Right. And but they say like, they're trying to hypothesize about how this could have evolved. And they're like, we can imagine there being debates about how to care for the ancestors and do they get hungry? And if so, what did they eat? And when I was reading that, I was like, who are they thinking was having these debates? Is it just like regular people? Right. Or anyway, maybe it doesn't matter, because this is obviously, as we're going to see, the way that this goes, it plays out to the benefits of the people at the top of the hierarchy.
Sure. I mean, to me, I'm just like, well, it's not like is everyone feeding their ancestors? Is this like actually an ancestor worship culture? Yeah. Is everyone honoring their ancestors?
At every level, right. So it's kind of a fractal, yeah. But
also, what they're also just calling the dead and ancestors in this case are specifically the dead monarchs. Yeah. And their people, their retinues. And so it's a little bit different because it's very specific dead. It's not the capital D dead.
Yes.
It's the dead pharaohs. And this matters to me when I'm thinking about it, partially because I'm like, well, it's not just that the dead are hungry for these things. It's that they have the same taste they had in life, which is they liked bread and wine, they like nice things.
Yeah, right. And so in case you missed that, because I jumped in, but what Janet was saying is that like, not only do the dead get hungry, but the dead want kind of the most refined stuff, which is leavened bread, not just crackers, but like the fancy leavened bread and the beer, like basically that's made from the wheat as well. And according to the Davids, what it actually sort of looks like is that, the dead monarchs need for these fanciest of foods, not just to be buried with them, but to be continually offered these things in perpetuity, is potentially even responsible to some degree for the intensification of agriculture, because enough of this bread and beer had to be produced to offer to the ancestors, that a system of labor and hierarchical organization of that labor evolved to meet this need, this need that was framed as being for the dead.
Right. But also they needed, they would provide for the corvée labor, the people who weren't being forced to work or they weren't enslaved. They actually had to feed them bread and wine as well.
Yeah.
Or beer.
Yeah. Really good point. Yeah. So So when you were doing your corvée labor, whether this was in later times, a little bit later, building pyramids or doing whatever it took, you would get the best of the food too.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So there was a perk.
Yeah. So the idea is that this was an organizing principle, and the way that this worked in favor of the pharaohs establishing power was partially through an emergent class system and debt peonage that would happen along with certain grain demands and food demands and labor demands related to all this.
Yeah.
And so what is framed as a hungry, dead situation,
right?
At least the way the Davids are saying it. I have a couple of things I think about that, is an organizing principle. And so it's what allows the emergence and establishment and enforcement of a class system and a peonage system, so.
Right. Yeah. This is something else that they elaborate on briefly, is that unsurprisingly, everybody was responsible to contribute, to this need. So it becomes basically a form of taxation.
Right.
The ritual needs of care for the dead, the dead rulers, and like the sort of organic or structural unevenness or inequalities in people's shifting abilities to contribute what was basically a tax would lead to some people going into debt and becoming subservient to the people who they owed money to, so then all of this stuff that we are very familiar with under capitalism comes into play because of the inflexibility of this. They don't use the word taxation, but it's basically a taxation regime where where this form of tribute or these kinds of offerings had to be provided, even if you had to go into debt to do it. Right. So then all of this stratification and economic fuckery comes into play from there.
Right. And the idea is, again, that the resources are being funneled up to the top, including to the dead monarchs, in exchange for the intercessional role of those monarchs in interacting with the divine and bringing blessings down on the kingdom. Right. So the exchange is you're going to owe us a pound of grain a month or whatever. Yeah. And for that, the whole kingdom will thrive.
And prosperity will rain down on the people and on the house of the monarch and all the things. And, the floods will come on time and the crops will, be good and all of that.
It was the original trickle down prosperity.
Yeah, right.
But it came from the divine. I want to point out one thing before we get more into this, just for any Egyptologists, people who are into traditional astrology, anybody who has a more of an interest in this culture and history. The Davids don't seem to be aware that this is not just a cult of the dead. It's not just a mortuary cult. The Egyptians are famously a star cult society. They track the stars. They move their temples and build their temples in relationship to whoever the heliacal rising star is. This is all about the stars. Yeah. The dead become the stars. And the deities are the stars and the sun.
Yeah, it's a big part of the mythology.
And so I'm not totally sure why that part is missing here. Because I do think that there's something. The idea was partially that these people would live on and continue to support. So they're dead technically in body form. Yeah. But they're not dead. Right. They're more...
Which is why they need all those people to go with them into the afterlife, because they need to continue their court in the afterlife.
They need they need the manicurist.
Grooming, and they need... and they need food.
And they need food. And so that is the idea. Now, even if we can say that is the belief system, and some of these people are very devout in their star cult beliefs, we can also say, and maybe this is where you're going next, that this worked for the power structure, right? That the accumulation of goods, of grains, of wines, is it doesn't all just disappear, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, this was something that seemed glaringly absent in here, especially as it's an analysis of a power structure and how it worked to fleece people and to perpetuate itself, is that offerings made to the temple and to the dead in these types of situations are typically consumed by the priests.
Right. Yeah.
You know, and
their retinues, probably.
And their retinues and everything. And I actually went online because I was like, I want to be sure I've got facts behind me on this. And I mean, I did about 45 minutes worth of research online. Different religions, different cultures around the world, offerings in the form of food and drink are routinely consumed by the monks, the priests, the people who are holding that space. Right. Not always all of it. Sometimes a certain amount is maybe given to the poor, or a certain amount is maybe burned in a ritual fire or something. But there's always some portion of it that, that's part of how that class of people, the religious priestly class,
the ritual specialists,
the ritual specialists survive.
Yeah. And thrive.
Even if they're not full-time in that position, because they're not always full-time priestly class or whatever, but they're consumed by the priests. And so I just think we need to insert this part into the narrative too, is that this taxation, this flow of material resources that are flowing, towards the mortuary cult is also literally enriching the material lives of the people who organize those cults.
Right. And if they know that, which you would think that they would, they're not emphasizing it. And I don't know, I have some theories around why that might be, but it's part of a bigger picture to me, which is just that this is what it makes it seem like a whole scam. When they tell the story, they're kind of like, who knows? I mean, who knows why? But they developed this whole system just to feed the dead. And you're like, well, I mean, that's the story.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's like any organizing story for power to become more powerful through controlling people through debt. It's a scam. Right. It's always a scam.
It's always a scam. Yeah.
And even if they had very intentional pious relationships with their dead and with the stars they became and with the stars they came from, it's still a scam to require each peasant to give you some grain every month.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we can wonder about why these types of things are left out of the book, maybe, and I can guess that maybe the Davids are they're more interested in presenting new framings than just rehearsing what we all kind of expect are these depressing old type of narratives about how power is a scam. But to paint a holistic picture of what's happening in these historical periods and even up to today, I think that it probably should be mentioned, even if it's not dwelled upon.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But back to what they are trying to do is say, Egypt has this very exemplary place in our heads and our understanding of the world and what a state looks like and what the birth of the state looks like.
Yeah.
But they're actually, they had sovereignty. They did have the bureaucratic administrative aspect that we see today. And so that's why it resonates so much with contemporary state citizens or people who understand the state in the way that we do today.
Yeah.
But that they're missing some other parts of the framing, including the heroic politics. For the most part. Yeah,
particularly the charismatic politics.
Right.
Exactly. For a lot of people, just the idea of the state is a principle of sovereignty and monopoly of violence plus a bureaucratic administration.
Right.
Those are the building blocks. And they want to say, well, there's this whole other thing that's actually part of it too, or can be. And that's the charismatic politics, rivalry between members of the elite class. But they want to say that the Egyptian example, at least in the time periods that are being discussed here, which, a lot of this is actually, a lot of what we've been talking about is before the rulers were called pharaohs.
Oh, right.
Which is why we haven't been using that term exclusively to talk about these guys. But anyway, in this period, sovereignty plus bureaucracy
was what this norm was.
Which they also say was characteristic of the Inca Empire. Sovereignty plus bureaucracy.
Right.
So they're building into calling these second order regimes.
Because they have two of the three.
Yeah, two of the three.
But what does seem to happen in Egypt once they are in more of the pharaonic period is that there seems to be like a swinging back and forth between the sovereignty and bureaucracy, and then when the state apparatus kind of falls apart a bit cyclically, then there will be a rise in heroic or competitive politics as people vie for the power.
Right. Yeah, because Egyptian prehistory has this thing, which I think we've talked about already, is that there's these dynastic periods where it's like the old kingdom, the middle kingdom, and then there's like the intermediate periods. It'll be like the first intermediate period, and the Davids are very critical of this framing where they're like, it makes it sound like these intermediate periods were just pauses where
nothing happened.
Like nothing happened or something. But here they're saying, that actually it was in these periods, interestingly, that charismatic politics came to the fore, where you did see a lot of small kingdoms or small kingships that were rivalrous against one another. And that was characteristic in Egypt of the intermediary period. They're not trying to say this is like a global pattern or anything like that.
I do want to say one thing quickly that's honestly kind of irrelevant to what we're talking about, but I noticed something in a passage when they're giving examples of the different more heroic competitive parts of Egyptian history. They share some passages of different leaders kind of like bragging about how great they are and why they should stay in power, and then there's this one part where he's just like, basically like, people have been starving, but not when I was in power. Everybody gets fed when I'm around. But in the list of all the ways he's great and provides for everyone, paternal care, he's just like, don't you have nice cosmetic oils to smell nice with me?
Right.
Everyone gets to smell good.
Egypt has been really, really big on the smelly cosmetic oils.
I love that part of the history. I love that part of the history,
Yeah.
And like, so
it's like, that's what, to be a really flourishing person who's truly alive is to smell good with these oils.
Smell good with the oils. I love it. And I don't know. I love it for a lot of reasons. And Egypt has a really important history. I mean, place in the history of aromatics and perfumery and incense. But that was like up there with eating, right?
Yeah.
He's like, eating, your children get to thrive, and you smell good,
Yeah. And this is all, kind of cool. There's a lot of cool detail in this chapter. Like they talk about how, in the pharaonic kingdoms, there's this principle of care where everybody's caring for the pharaoh. Right. The care flows upwards. But then in these intermediary periods, you still have kings and stuff, but the kings present themselves still using a principle of care, but the care is flowing downwards where he's like, I care for all of you. I'm the most caring, and that's how they
You've never been cared for like this before.
You've never been cared for. So it's all these different angles on care that are still active. Yeah. But we kind of breezed over a period in the chapter where they sort of go around to some of their areas of interest. They go to Mesopotamia again. They go to China. They go to Mesoamerica and talk about different examples of second order regimes, which we're not going to go into detail here. Right. But I did like this one quote at the bottom of 410 where they actually say, so what do these, quote, early states have in common, if anything? And they're actually willing to tell us some things that they have in common, making a generalization. And they say that all deployed spectacular violence at the pinnacle of the system, right? So there was always a spectacle of violence at the pinnacle. They all ultimately depended on, and to some degree, mimicked the patriarchal organization of households. So this patriarchy at the household level, just like you were saying, is a common feature, seemingly worldwide, about second order regimes. And the third thing is that the apparatus of government stood on top of some kind of a division of society into classes. So here they are finally talking about class and actually highlighting it. They're highlighting it as, that the government is held up by a society that's already divided into class. So this becomes basically a requirement for these forms of power to emerge.
Right. Yeah, that's good to point out. So in this next section, they're going to talk a bit about bureaucracy and administration. And again, they describe how people in modern bureaucratic societies look back on Egypt and go like, that is a state. Yes, that makes sense. There's record keeping and distribution and tribute/taxation, and big things get done. There's order, that we, because of how we are trained to think about the world, look at that and say, like, that is a state. And so, they are arguing against that a little bit here and there, but also they want to point to the fact that projection onto the past, or the assumption of how things are now being how things have to be when you're organizing large groups of people, implies that bureaucracy emerges from complex societies that have a lot of people, that you kind of have to start having this bureaucratic apparatus to run it, and that you need it. It's a necessary emerging factor,
right,
in any kind of large society.
In what you might call a mechanistic sense.
Yes. Right.
It
just kind of happens because you have to have it.
Yeah. And this is called, in one of the footnotes, they mentioned the concept of scalar stress.
Oh, right.
Which I think is kind of useful, even though it's a little wonky. But, scalar as in coming from scale. Mm-hmm. That increasing scale of a population creates stress on the ability to just coordinate things, coordinate activity, and that the solution to the stress is hierarchical administration.
Right.
And that this is almost like a mechanistic, deterministic thing.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I mean, this is how it gets talked about.
Right.
Is what they're saying.
Yeah, and then they cite, their favorite straw men to argue with again, which are the people who are historical theorists who don't have a lot of background in studying history, like Jared Diamond, but people like that who basically assume the current
and Robin
state.
Dunbar, they quote him too, who's
he's more qualified.
He's an evolutionary psychologist or something.
We'll say no. But they assume the current situation and project it onto the past, and are like, right, this is what has to happen. Bureaucracy has to be in place for society to work, and it's just a natural emerging factor. But what they're pointing to here is a few examples of grassroots administrative organization that came before power conglomeration and predate it. So they give a couple examples of this. One is from a archaeological dig in Iraqi Kurdistan. It's, what is it called? Tel Sabi Abad?
That's right. Tel Sabi Abad.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're saying that right, but yeah.
Sorry.
And this is from about 6200 BC.
Right.
So quite old.
8,000 years ago.
Yeah. And this, I just want to note here as a quick aside that for some of this Egyptian and Mesopotamian stuff, we are getting into territory where David Wengrow has actually been doing archaeological work.
It's firsthand.
So he's
reporting.
I'm not sure if he's participated in this particular dig, but he's definitely in the region, and it's getting closer to his firsthand experience. Yeah.
At this dig in, I guess some of it's in Syria and some of it's in Iraqi Kurdistan. This is like 3,000 years before writing, but there's signs of collective administration, kind of like the Mesoamerican site that we talked about. There is uniform and identical housing here, which is interesting.
Right.
And also there appears to be an attempt to use record keeping, which they do with these tokens, or there's evidence of piles of tokens that seem to be about organizing chores, sharing tasks, and
keeping track of stores
and keeping track of how much they have.
Is that right too? Yeah.
So,
because some of them are on corks and anyway.
There's also, so they're projecting a lot onto this partially because they, we don't know what was actually happening there, but there doesn't seem to be a conglomeration of power, a hierarchy. It seems more equal, but there seems to be record keeping. And so they're arguing here that records can be kept also to keep things fair.
Right. And that maybe the original forms of record keeping were
about fairness and not about unequal distribution.
It was kind of a grassroots form of accounting that was with the purpose of keeping things equal. And then, they talk about how people's housing was equal and stuff to kind of lend some weight to, they're like, oh, this was maybe even reflected in the housing. They have an aside on how it almost seems like difference between people was being erased for this particular time period.
Right. even as there were a lot of technological advances, there were some advances in metallurgy and horticulture and textiles.
Yeah.
There was starting to be more long-distance trade, but there still seemed to be more of a... I mean, equality is not exactly the word, but it's like more evenly distributed.
More evenly distributed, right. And like we can speculate that maybe people were sort of developing the means that would ideally prevent these new technological revolutions that were happening at the time from creating greater inequality.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's evidence in that in the Andean societies, the villages where that would become the Incan Empire as well.
Yeah, right. So they jump over to the Andes, and like the Ailu, which were talked about previously in the book, were these sort of local administrative units where they did record keeping in the form of this complex knot tying.
Quipu strings,
yeah. We can actually say with a bit more historical detail what was happening in the Inca situation.
There's a record of that,
because there's more, And
it's more recent, and there's a record from the Spanish.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it's clear that the Inca Empire basically appropriated these local and more horizontal in spirit methods of record keeping and kind of twisted them to the needs of empire.
Right.
Too, which is a pattern that, of course, we'll see all over the place, where record keeping, symbolic notation, and eventually money itself, which all have this kind of captivating neutrality to them. You know, it's just math, can be turned towards the needs of empire.
Right.
You know, but empire does not invent these forms of record keeping.
And maybe it doesn't naturally emerge just as empire scales up.
Right.
It's appropriated.
Yeah, it's appropriated by. Yes, that's right.
You know, although there are certain forms of bureaucracy that it becomes bureaucratic and not just administrative at a certain point.
Yeah, right. That's a good distinction to make, because if we talk about bureaucracy, then maybe we are talking about power and hierarchy. But administration or accounting or record keeping, all of these things, which are important in bureaucracies, can also be used in a leveling, egalitarian way.
Yeah, which is, I mean, of course they can be, but it's like one of those things that when you hear it, you're like, oh, right. We keep records for fairness too, you know, and some of us, you know, we keep records in our small communities.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, right. And we might, if we didn't know about this history, we might see that as kind of taking a tool of domination and trying to appropriate it to our ends.
Right.
You know, but they're telling us that maybe the story is a little different, that it was our quote unquote tool originally.
Right.
And only later got perverted into something that manages domination.
Yeah, because one thing they point out is, you may remember from earlier in the book when we talked about Madame de Graffet, is that her name? Yeah. The one who wrote the book about the Incan princess. It was like Letter from an Incan Princess. It was that kind of celebrated the Incan Empire as this socialist government that just cared for everyone, and no one went poor, no one ate. And what they point out is that the thriving of the citizens of the Incan Empire was due to the Ailu, that it was the grassroots care of these small organizations that actually took care of day-to-day life for citizens and not the empire. The empire level actually expropriated the resources. And when you compare the Quipu, like the string record keeping of the grassroots people, those knots could be unraveled, they could be dissolved, you might start over, but debts were forgiven.
Yeah.
The difference with the empire Quipu system was that those knots were permanent, never retied, never unraveled.
Right.
You were always maintaining debt with the empire in that system.
It transitions into something where the tools, like the record keeping, becomes inflexible.
Right.
Where, no, this is your debt.
Right.
That doesn't go away.
Well, and also what arises when there's more of a sovereign bureaucracy, a bureaucracy of the state, is a system becomes more opaque. The rules get more arbitrary and hard to understand. Like that's the form of domination that has to do with control of knowledge and that power through knowledge. Yeah. So it would be like overly complex system of record keeping that no one can really understand. It becomes sort of a specialized knowledge, you know, like like the tax system here in the US or something, you know, and so that but instead of it being like a clear thing everyone understands, it becomes more opaque and more arbitrary.
Yeah. Yeah, right. I mean, there's some pretty fascinating, I don't want to call it speculation, but like theorization or something in this part of the chapter where they're kind of ruminating on, well, okay, so record keeping and all of this started as a tool to prevent inequality.
Mm-hmm.
If this was true, then how is it that it works so well as a tool of oppression?
Mm-hmm.
And part of what they argue is that accounting procedures actually can lend an air of fairness to oppressive systems because they have this facade of neutrality.
Totally.
You know, it's just the numbers,
right,
honey.
Right.
Like, this is just how much you earned and this is how much you owe, you know? And so it takes the oppression out of the realm of just people having power over other people and displaces it onto a supposedly neutral and, as you're saying, sometimes very complicated and Byzantine system of accounting. And that fairness and neutrality can sometimes lead people to just get wrapped up in it, not knowing that the powerful are just going to use those tools to oppress others.
Right.
You know, I've just been reading this book called One River by Wade Davis. It's a great book. There's a whole section in the middle of the book that details, mercifully, sort of briefly, but the brutality of the rubber boom in South America. Famously brutal and terrorizing,
so terrible,
extractive system under which a lot of indigenous people were killed, were tortured, were raped, all to get rubber out of the Amazon to be used for industry. And it was entirely organized through a system of debt.
Right.
You know, where people would have to go into debt to get the tools to collect the rubber.
Right.
And it was arranged so that they could never get out of debt. And so they were, for all practical purposes, enslaved through debt. And this is not unique. These types of schemes have been run all over the world, going back to some of the earliest times, you know, and David Graeber's book, Debt, would be a good place to go for more information about this.
Yeah, such a good book.
Right?
Yeah.
And
well, part of what I wanted to add to this, that's a good example. And, you know, I think that
I just want to say that people accept entering into these kinds of agreements, partially because they're coerced, but also partially because it's hard to argue with the supposed neutrality
of the numbers
of the accounting system.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I will say that, you know, with the rubber trade, that was definitely through violent coercion that people entered into it. And that is a truly horrifying story, too, which I think that when we were recording in the fall, I was reading One River. And I brought it up sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
So that's kind of funny.
I think you're right.
Just want to say, like, yes, in fact, it's true. Another one of us is reading One River now, and we'll be bringing it up.
And we can read 2 books at once. It's possible to do. Yeah.
Whew. Yep. It can happen. Although, wow, the amount that I've been reading other books has gone way down in the past year. Anyway, but what I was going to say is that one thing they point out here is that the state bureaucracy, the bureaucratization of relations also is impersonal, that legal equality is this sort of impersonal equivalence. Like at the ILU level, when there was record keeping, it's like, you know, everybody, you know, be like, well, yeah, that person didn't do as much this month, but they lost a family member, you know, so we're going to maybe not count the knot this time or whatever, you know, not track that debt to the collective. But once it becomes a state apparatus, once it's a full bureaucracy and not just an administrative tool of the people,
right,
then it's impersonal.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, and it's kind of impersonal in a way. I mean, it can become more impersonal.
Yes.
But it's also a little bit baked in that it's impersonal. And I think this is part of what they're saying, is that they're saying, yeah, okay, like accounting can be a tool for the people and it can be used that way, and it has been, and in fact, maybe it began like that, but also the impersonality, the impersonalness, I don't know, of the tool is part of what lends itself to scaling up as something that dehumanizes people.
Right.
So there's a weakness in the tool, I think.
When all sweetness all of when a long walk goes becomes of its own. Oh, why my eyes looking back from the other side.
Are we ready to move on to the sort of the closing thoughts on this section? Because at the end here, we're not quite to the end of the chapter because there is a coda to this chapter, which is its own interesting story, and we'll get to that.
There's an add-on, for sure.
They're kind of wrapping up their thoughts about this question of the origin of the state and all this. They return to this idea and kind of put a finer point to this idea of early, what we might call state power, but, kingship, empire, being, I think this is what they're saying, like, largely spectacular.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say spectacular, I mean a spectacle above all.
Yes.
Like
it might also be flashy.
A performance.
Yeah.
It's something that is performed and needs to be performed and is maybe like only occasionally performed.
Mm-hmm.
Right? This is like a theme in the book too, is about people kind of like moving in and out of power relations.
Right.
Where yes, there's a time when we have to like obsequiously prostrate ourselves before the king, or there's a time when we have to like walk away from our homes and go participate in this building project and it's going to be the tomb for the king or something. But these are just occasional.
Mm-hmm.
They're not exactly saying that's true of now, but they are suggesting they want us to ask, to what extent is this still true of now?
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of, because they're saying like there's never been a hard break. It's just a change in degree. So in some of these tellings of the Davids, the king is in some ways like this big baby that needs to just get coddled sometimes.
Right. And he has really special needs.
He's got very special needs. They tell this very amusing story of a king on the island of Fiji. It's a story that's told by a missionary who had lived there in the 1800s, but at sunrise every day, there was a rule, it was absolute silence. And then the herald of the king would proclaim that the king was about to chew his kava root. And all the subjects would go, chew it! Followed by a thunderous roar once the ritual was completed. And they're kind of, this is amusing. And also they're saying like, if this is all that it takes to be the subject of a king, then how bad is that kind of? They're kind of talking around this kind of idea. Yeah. So you're quiet at sunrise and then you go chew it and then he's happy, And in this type of context, they call back to the idea of play farming as they were examining the so-called origins of agriculture, that maybe, for a long time, people were just play farming. And that maybe we could talk similarly about the so-called origins of the state, consisting in large measure of people engaged in doing play kingdoms. I get what they're trying to point to here, but I don't know if that framing works as well for me.
No.
Because, I wrote on my notes, I was like, who is doing the playing?
Yeah. Especially in the ones where
when people are getting sacrificed.
Yeah, I was going to say, when there's actually often a sacrificial component, like, right. Yeah, who's playing around?
Yeah.
I just keep wondering, like, do they just mean something different by the word play or something? Like, what? And why is that different than they don't like people saying proto or pre. And is it that different?
Well, play is supposed to return agency.
Oh, yeah.
Proto is more like history is the puppeteer, right. That's kind of pulling everything into these patterns.
Right.
And people are just the puppets. Mm-hmm. But if you're saying that you're doing play farming, then it's like the people are playing around with these new techniques.
Forms, yeah.
With these forms.
Mm-hmm.
And they're kind of trying to invoke that here and say like, oh, like maybe people were just kind of playing with like, let's have this guy who we let be the king, and, because people are always trying to get power. And so let's like just tell this guy he has it. and we'll like coddle him, you know, but maybe that having been done, we can just live our fucking lives most of the time.
Right.
You know, this seems to be the idea. They even talk about, you know, this is reminding me of some stuff that we haven't covered here, but where they talk about the Shilluk and the Reth, and about how the Shilluk people, who are a Nilotic people in Egypt, who they talk about in the book, seem to maybe be choosing having like a theoretically very powerful monarch, but who they can really depose at any minute if they want to, over having like a more bureaucratic system of power that actually reaches more significantly into their daily lives.
Right.
You know, and so, I mean, I think this is all part of the conversation they're trying to have.
Right. Yeah.
But I do feel compelled to point out that even in these forms of power, that in some ways the Davids they're kind of downplaying it. You know, because they're like, oh, this guy who chooses kava root in the morning, maybe that's not so bad. And yeah, compared to what we live under now, sure, maybe that's not so bad. But also just to point out that like, even these, if you want to call them play kings, these like mostly ceremonial kings whose power is just in theory or something, are still given a really good burial, doted on in life, live in the biggest house in town. Right? There's like a material basis to them also being the king.
And they usually have like unlimited access to women in all of the cultures.
Yeah, there's all kinds of perks that are material. It's not just about power in the sense of being able to give orders that can't be disobeyed. It's also about the flow of resources and who gets to have the best life. And there being a pyramid of material provisioning at which the king is at the top, and then the people in his family are like also benefit, and then his court and the people who, you know, and all of this. And there's labor and resources that all flow in this direction, and that's important.
Right.
And it's important in a way that this chapter doesn't really dwell on very much. It's kind of like what we were saying about how the priests consume the offerings that are left for the dead in Egypt. But like this attention to, you know, so this is the spectacular face of it. But also let's look at the material
their substance
part that is enabling that, that is enabling that kind of spectacular power. And it left me with the thought that, you know, so this book, you know, in the schema that we've established way back on the podcast between materialism and idealism, that this book tends to the more idealistic explanations and prescriptions. But this chapter, maybe more than any, is strictly an account of the cultural manifestations of the way these societies are structured. And Graeber is a cultural anthropologist. So what are the rituals like? You know, how is the culture explicitly organized? Like, what do they say about what they're doing? Right? Versus the material thing, which tracks, you know, what's kind of happening behind the scenes as far as like the resources and, you know, who gets what. But in previous chapters, they've at least been willing to go into dialogue with the material relations. You know, I'm thinking just as one prominent example in the example about the Californian indigenous people versus the people of the Northwest. And, you know, the whole debate about acorns versus salmon and to what degree the material substrate influenced the way that the culture came up. They were at least entering into dialogue with this. But here, it's kind of like just hearing one side of a conversation, like where you're listening to someone who's talking on the phone and all you can hear is what they're saying. They're only describing the cultural aspects, the cultural component of what is happening in these cultures, in these first and second order regimes. And I think that it's that exclusive focus that kind of makes it easier to downplay these kingdoms as being like significantly oppressive.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point that we're, and you know, again, from the beginning of the book, we talked about how a lot of critics of this book have an issue with what's being left out consistently.
Right.
And then for them to be making as strong of a point and argument, because we're really getting into some like core arguments of the book sections, this last third of the book or wherever we are, that they are really letting the the material go to the wayside.
I think that they do have something important to say, for sure, about how power projects itself to be more powerful than it actually is.
Sure. That's a good point. Yeah.
I think that that is something that's actually very important. They quote somebody I've never heard of named Philip Abrams at the end of this section, saying that we need to be attentive to the gap between what elites claim they can do and what they actually can do.
Right.
Because there is an aspect to power that is spectacular.
Right.
That is just like, we will crush you, if you don't, but actually, does the state have the power to actually crush you? Right? There can be a gap between what's projected and what is materially possible. In this way, materialism is maybe in here.
Right.
Because what can they actually do? How much of the power is actually material and how much of it is spectacular?
Well, and then that's them actually pointing to the scam part. Where they're just they only have that if you choose to believe it.
Right. Yeah. So there is this kind of emperor has no clothes or whatever. What's it called? The emperor's new clothes aspect to this. And this is part of the empowerment trick that they're trying to do, is to get us to question the spectacular aspect of power.
Right.
And some of us have actually seen the forces of the state and the police actually go into extreme disarray.
Right.
When confronted with people in protest or a natural disaster that disrupts business as usual. And we actually see the state as inadequate and vulnerable and actually unable to maintain hegemony over the territories that they claim to control. So this is actually applicable even in our modern day.
Right. Yeah, that all makes sense. And it's interesting because they are pointing to, at the end of this chapter, which, as Dave mentioned, is a coda. They call it a coda. It does feel tacked on, and yet we are grateful.
Yes.
It's there.
Yeah.
But at first I was like, how is this connected? What? Not unusual in the book. They talk about how civilization, as it's kind of currently understood, is almost equivalent to empire, the concept of civilization.
Yeah, right. Oh, yeah. I loved this part.
This part is so cool. And then they're like, but actually, civilization, the word comes from the Latin civilis, which means the quality of political wisdom and mutual aid. That's a very Graeber Wengrow definition. But civilis as meaning personal responsibility between community members, that there's voluntary coalition and organization to create a life together.
And I didn't know that.
Yeah, me either.
This actually comes as a correction to something that we said on the podcast a few episodes ago, where we were theorizing that civilization, civic, that these words actually relate somehow to words for cities.
Right.
And what they're saying is no, city
itself comes from that.
Yeah, exactly. It's the other way around.
Yeah, right. And they're pointing to this, so this is a point to the history that they would like to be written, which is they're we want the history of true civilization. We want the history of voluntary coalition and cooperation to create a life together, and they're it's no wonder that civilization has a bad rep if we equate it with empire. But actually, they are pointing out that often there will be these archaeological sites that show domestic life, ritual, hospitality before there's a conglomeration of power coming up. And that is some evidence of this kind of civilization they're talking about, that voluntary creation.
Yeah.
Co-creation.
Yeah.
And what they point out here is often these are realms that are identified with women, where it's community care and the domestic sphere, and sometimes it's ritual life as well. And they point out that as we see empire develop downstream from these conditions or these places where there seems to be more of a civilization, then we see usually ambitious politics rise up alongside the subjugation and marginalization of women.
Right.
And so they're identifying here that stream of the patriarchal power dynamic that becomes codified and actually subverts and deprioritizes women and women's power.
At the same time as what are arguably women's innovations become appropriated by the male-dominated power structure, or at least instrumentalized by. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And then they are generally women are denied access to power or positions
Right.
of power in the culture as the hierarchy develops.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they point that out, and I think that's a fruitful place to think, and it's generative, but they don't spend much time there.
Mm-hmm.
But
I do want to say, I mean, I just want to reinforce this idea of recasting civilization positively,
Right.
and in the same stroke, extending it to people who lived outside of cities, outside of empires, where they want to say, hey, these technologically and socially very sophisticated cultures that we could see in like the Hopewell sphere in prehistoric North America, this is a civilization.
right.
And it does a couple things. On one hand, it sort of recognizes the achievement that's happening in these societies. And at the same time, it kind of rescues the concept of civilization from just being equivalent to everything that's bad,
Right. Right.
you know? So yeah, I like what they're doing here.
They're trying to reclaim the word.
Yeah.
And I think that we've been so indoctrinated with civilization as empire that we didn't even know it was a word that needed reclaiming, you know, and that, you know, settler colonial empire has used civilizing as a violent colonizing force. Right.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And so that's part of the
That's a
reason
great point.
we have
Yeah.
a really bad
Yeah.
taste in our mouths with
that
the word
word,
civilization.
yeah, to
And,
civilize.
Yes.
Yes, exactly.
and so we might not, some might argue we can't actually get this one back.
Uh-huh.
And that might be true. But what we can say is let's celebrate what it is about creating civic life together that is not coercive and violent, but is based on cooperation and creating beauty together,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
which takes us to Minoan Crete.
Always happy to go to Minoan Crete.
I mean, wouldn't you love to go to Minoan Crete?
Yeah, always happy to
You would
go
have to wear less clothes. There, it appears.
I'm fine with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so yeah, they take us to Minoan Crete. Again, this part's a bit of an add-on, but Minoan Crete, so Crete is maybe the southernmost island of what's identified as Greek culture in the Aegean Sea. It's a pretty warm...
Something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And was famously excavated, the sites there by Sir Arthur Evans, the British archaeologist. Knossos, Knossos, was a site that he
Knossos, yes. Yes.
excavated. But
This is the setting of the story of Theseus and, and the Minotaur
yes.
and the labyrinth
Yes.
and Ariadne.
And Ariadne.
Anyway,
Yeah.
mythologically very resonant
Oh,
place.
yeah, for sure. So one thing that's interesting, well, there's a lot that's interesting about Minoan Crete. So Minoan meaning Minoan culture as distinct from the surrounding Greek cultures,
Right.
you know. And the Minoan culture,
Not Hellenic.
not Hellenic, before Hellenic.
Yeah.
Although there's a clash of cultures eventually between those. But then Minoan society, their art is very different from the art on frescoes and on pottery around them. And unlike the art around them, there are a lot of women figures, female figures on this art. They are often larger than the male figures. They're never naked. They often have on very... it makes it seem almost like busy, like intricate patterned skirts, and then a sort of open top. And they're often being served by scantily clad men. And the men are smaller, and they're naked, usually. And then in addition to that, there was not an evidence of monarchy. I'm not sure, you know, they have been accused of thinking absence of evidence is evidence of absence, but there doesn't seem to be as much hierarchy in this culture from what is shown. There are these big palatial rooms, which Sir Arthur Evans called throne rooms, or this main throne room he saw at Knossos. But since then, identical ritual spaces have been uncovered other places, and there are clearly frescoes on the walls of those sites that show them to actually be the site of a menstrual ritual. And so, you know, some people see a throne room everywhere.
Yeah.
When there may be a place for lunar menstrual rituals, actually.
Right.
As what's happening.
Right.
And that's part of the point of this end of the chapter is there, like, the level of projection that we get onto these sites. You know, here we have iconography that clearly shows women in power, or if the roles were reversed, we would assume they were just male aristocrats or male leaders being served by women, naked women.
Right.
Which is how they are read in other cultures around them. But Sir Arthur Evans and other archaeologists of his time, and since then until pretty recently, have seen, they're like, well, those are goddesses. Those aren't actually women rulers.
Or priestesses.
Yeah.
Yeah. So even if it's priestesses, which is kind of a power role, it's still not quite saying that they're politically in power.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And this section is worth reading. I'm not going to go into it a ton here, but like there's some really beautiful sections of exposition about this culture that they highlight, and how just it seems it's not very fortified. There's very little to no evidence of military action, which might be how they were conquered by the Hellenes. Yeah. But they seem to have a culture based on the erotic and on play.
Yeah.
And dominated by women. So the Davids are clearly like into
with
it.
some kind of bull
there's
cult going on in there
the bull
too.
cult. Oh yeah, the young men had to run naked amongst the bulls.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's one of the things that they do.
And the Minotaur has the head of a bull.
The Minotaur has the head of a bull, and there's a lot of bull iconography, and also the imagery here does tie back to Maria Gambudis's work as well. Like she saw some continuity of images between what was excavated here and her prehistoric digs.
Yeah, this is all super fascinating. I read a novel that I could recommend that is called, what's it called? The King Must Die?
The King Must Die.
It's called The King Must Die by Mary Renault, or Mary Renault, however you say that. And it was written in the 50s. And it's the story of Theseus, told from his point of view. And he has a lot of adventures. He visits the priestess at Eleusis. He goes to Athens. But he eventually makes his way to Crete, and a large section of the book is Theseus' adventure in Minoan Crete. And this is all just a retelling of myth. But Mary Renault drew from the most current archaeology and historical accounts that she could get her hands on to portray this in like as close to historical accuracy as she could imagine to do. And so the part of the book that is set in Crete, it does give you a sense, it's not quite a matriarchy, but Theseus goes there because he's a Hellene, and he's part of this patriarchal culture that is trending towards, a kind of austere, more Spartan, militaristic and patriarchal type of cultural style. And then he goes to Crete, and it's way more kind of feminized and eroticized, just the day-to-day lives of the people. There's a lot more, it's not as like muscular and militaristic in the way that he's used to.
It's more of a Dionysian culture almost,
It's a little bit more Dionysian. It's clearly, it's written in the book as being tied more to like the old religion, like what was administered by the women.
Right.
That Theseus is familiar with from the women in his ancestry.
Right.
But he goes to Crete and he's like, oh, it's like time hasn't moved forward here. Anyway, it's a fascinating story. It's cool. What we're leaving out, and what the book leaves out too, is there's this question of Minos.
Oh, yeah.
Who is sometimes rendered as King Minos. Who there is some male figure, at least mythologically, that exists here. Because, Ariadne is supposed to be his daughter, blah, blah, blah. And he appears in the book I'm talking about too. But I researched this a little bit, and it's true that there's no historical evidence that he existed at all. And might potentially just be an entirely mythological figure.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, now if we're going to get to choose a monarchy where the king is only mythic, that sounds pretty good.
Yeah, right.
No, that sounds better than a play king that could actually have me killed.
Where you have a lot of stories about your king, but there's no actual
There's no
king.
Yeah, that's the one I would sign up for.
Yeah.
I think part of their point here is just that in case you've gotten the idea that there has to be patriarchy to have good ordered society or something, or to have a complex, sophisticated society, they're like, this looks pretty matriarchal. People don't want to say that. But women seem to have a pretty strong place in this culture. You know, and they have nice stuff. They have these palaces, and it's not as hierarchical seeming, but they have very nice ritual spaces and nice baths. And they also talk about how the trade goods reflect that women were kind of in charge because they did have trade. And what's brought in, especially from Egypt, is more of the different ritual items from the cult of Hathor in Egypt. So it's matriarchal or basically like divine feminine religion that they are bringing in. They bring in, guess what? Cosmetics. Cosmetic oils,
tubs
perfumes.
Of facial creams and stuff like this.
So the Egyptians had the really nice cosmetics and they brought those in. And so even the trade goods that you find here on Crete are...
Right, that's part of the evidence is that they're like, well, someone was ordering that all of this stuff got brought from
in,
Egypt. Yeah.
So anyway, this is
and
just...
it probably wasn't the men.
Right.
Right.
I mean, it's hard. What was happening with the men?
Although in this day and age, I mean, this is part of what's in The King Must Die too, is that the men drench themselves in aromatic oils and like all this stuff
that's true for sure.
too. I mean, there was definitely like the attention to the body in not exactly cosmetic, but cosmetic adjacent type of way was something that transcended all the genders.
Yeah, all the genders wanted to smell good, have smooth skin, and in this, in a lot of the cultures, and would participate in that. Yeah, oil and luxuriate the body, exfoliate, all of the things. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Anyway, so that's kind of where they leave off. I can't believe we have 2 chapters left, but boy, they're doozies.
Well, yeah, that's right. We have, hold on, let's see here.
Full circle is the next one.
Oh my gosh, we have 1 chapter, which is the next chapter, and then there's the conclusion, which is really a chapter in itself because it's about as long as a chapter. So yes, we have got 2 chapters left. And as you might guess by the title of the next one, Full Circle, there is a return. There's a tying things together that reaches all the way back to the beginning.
To Candy-Aronk.
Including Candy-Aronk and Turtle Island culture at the time of conquest and before.
Yeah.
So I'm very much looking forward to covering the next chapter with y'all.
Yeah. All right.
Take care.
Bye.
We'll see you.